It's not just one of the few currencies that the US dollar hasn't been able to sink so far. The so-called Mexican super peso was the only currency that appreciated during the third quarter of 2022 despite the dollar's strength driven by the Fed's aggressive interest rates. But in 2023, there's a dollar determined to beat the Mexican peso under the predictions of international rating agencies like Moody's. And on the other hand, there's a so-called super peso that has defied all possible predictions. But will the US dollar be able to sink the only currency in the world against which it hasn't been able to gain ground this year? The Mexican peso. How is it that the peso has challenged the world's strongest currency, and will it be able to continue doing so for longer? And while we're on the subject, why is the dollar killing most currencies on the world market except for a few, including Mexico's? Well, I'm Victor, and in this video, I'm going to explain it to you.
The US dollar has gained 18% against other currencies this year. A strong dollar is good news for the United States, but bad news for the rest of the global economy. The impact is especially great in developing countries.
The peso has posted 3 consecutive weeks of gains against the dollar to approach its best level of the year. Expectations are that interest rates will rise faster in Mexico, its strongest level since early March 2020 when there was still no pandemic. In Mexico, the peso closed 2022 with a gain against the US dollar, something historic that had not been seen in more than a decade, with an appreciation of more than 4.8% during one of the most difficult times in the world. To put that in context, the peso is one of the major emerging currencies, and together with the Brazilian real, it is one of the few that has not collapsed due to the pressures of the dollar and the activities of the Fed on the economy in the United States, but also in Latin America and also around the world. The reality is that 2022 was a year of failures and defeats for many global economies, from the outbreak of war in Ukraine to numerous natural disasters and new COVID surges that threatened the entire world with a food crisis and inflation like never before. But even with all these war, health, and economic storms, the Mexican peso continued to fluctuate. And what at first seemed like it would be an unstoppable devaluation ended up being quite the opposite. Since the pandemic began, one crisis after another has hit the world's economies of all kinds, to the point that many are predicting unprecedented stagflation for this year, which means, in short, stagnation and a decline in the quality of life for everyone.
What is stagflation? It is an economic crisis or situation in which 3 conditions occur: high inflation, an increase in consumer prices, and reduced, stagnant, or negative economic growth. But the
outlook is uncertain, because even in the midst of so much chaos, some emerging markets like Mexico are staying afloat, while major powers such as the United States, China, and Russia are experiencing new outbreaks, wars, and internal inflation. Other prosperous nations such as Europe and Japan are making changes to their monetary policies, mainly to calm the high costs resulting from a new wave of the pandemic and market nervousness due to the difficult and uncertain future of industries and imports and exports worldwide. However, despite all this, to the surprise of the world, the Mexican peso is now the second best valued currency against the dollar, only behind the Brazilian real, and it has been enjoying good appreciation because there is demand and it is moving well in the market. But how is it that the Mexican peso has managed to gain such great ground against the US dollar while the dollar is undermining the most powerful currencies in the world? Well, there are several factors or points that explain the rise of the Mexican peso and why the United States, despite affecting most of the world's economies, influences Mexico for the better. Many times we have complained about our rich neighbor to the north, but this is not one of those times. On the contrary, and these are some of the keys that have turned the Mexican currency into the so-called super peso. In In recent months, the central banks of many countries, including Mexico, have made adjustments to their interest rate policies to unblock the economy in light of the pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. To better understand it, the Fed, which is the US Federal Reserve System, is the one that decides whether interest rates go up or down. And what they have been doing is precisely that, raising interest rates, making everything more expensive, from credit to 1 liter of oil or a can of milk. And Mexico paid close attention to these inflation rates in the United States throughout 2022 and began to mirror the way the dollar was acting. Every time the Fed in Washington, for example, raised interest rates on the dollar, even by a tiny fraction in Mexican territory or the Bank of Mexico or Banjico, they did exactly the same, moderating their rates to a target base of 50 points. And with that, Mexico managed to build a kind of shield that prevented the dollar from appreciating the Mexican peso and reducing inflation forecasts even for 2023. Historically, other currencies in the world began to copy this Mexican strategy last year. And here comes Japan, for example, which decided to do the same and also raised its interest rates to 50 points and expanded the fluctuation range of its government bonds, which are basically the long-term credit of companies and investors. And the reason why countries like Japan followed Mexico's example is because after the miracle of the Mexican super peso occurred last year, experts estimated that the yield on the mono or the Mexican bond with a 10-year term would have better returns than even the US dollar with 6%. The latest report from the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, LINEI, revealed that in the last quarter, the supply and demand indices for goods and services increased compared to the previous period, adding to the fact that inflation in Mexico declined from November onwards, and domestic consumption, imports, and exports even reached their highest levels since the pandemic.
According to INEGI, in December 2022, the National Consumer Price Index registered an increase of 0.38% compared to the previous month. Annual headline inflation stood at 7.82%. In the third quarter of 2022, manufacturing sector exports reached $120.898 billion, 24.4% more than what was registered last year during the same period.
All this placed the Mexican peso in the field of gains and consolidated a positive outlook compared to the poor performance of other economies in other Latin American countries and the world, such as Argentina, Chile, or Colombia, for example. Needless to say, Latin America is a potentially emerging region, and Mexico in particular has become a top-tier foreign investment destination when compared to the United States. Bond yields, different inflation expectations, and rising domestic consumption that has revalued the peso were the main reasons that tipped the scales in favor of our country. In short, market volatility, which is when assets increase or decrease in price in a very short period of time, is used to measure the profitability of these assets in rapid but short-term movements. And this is where the real value of the Mexican domestic market lies, and why it will reach high levels not seen in a long time.
The day has come, and the Mexican peso is overcoming all obstacles to reach close to 19 units per dollar. Its best moment since the distant 2020. When the economic crisis caused by the pandemic began, Latin America was the first region to begin raising its interest rates on loans. What must be taken into account is that markets operate on expectations, so there are markets that expect the Central Bank of Mexico to decide on a sharp increase in rates so that the peso can strengthen.
Given the general outlook is one of fear and uncertainty, economies such as those of the United States, Mexico, and Japan are now setting the trends to combat inflationary pressures worldwide. It is easy for investors to obtain credit, for example, from the market. This has been a policy for years, but it is only now, in times of emergency, that central banks must respond to the costs of these risky returns and be able to ensure a prosperous economy. Mexico has always been open to this business and has now responded well by setting its interest rates by copying the Fed in the United States, which has made the Mexican peso a very attractive currency in international markets. As you know, Mexico and the United States have had a highly integrated economy practically since they were founded, which means mutual benefits for both markets such as exports, tourism, direct investment, and even remittances between the two countries, or mainly from the United States to Mexico. And this works like a domino effect, where it is in Mexico's interest that the United States and the dollar are strong. For example, the US labor market is very active with low unemployment rates, which explains why Mexico accumulated a record $32 billion in remittances in the first half of 2022 alone, and an annual growth of 19% exports.
Remittances sent by Mexicans abroad broke records. The Aztec country receives the most money in the world, which also shows its economic weakness.
Remittances, that is, the money that people send to Mexico in dollars, reached a historic high in October. There were 360,000 that arrived that month. That brings the cumulative total of remittances between January and October of this year to a stratospheric figure of $48.338 billion.
As I mentioned at the beginning, the peso's victory against the dollar does not mean that Mexico's economy is now forever immune to the dollar. So far, fortunately, Banxico's measures have managed to reduce inflation, but whether it will continue to be so also depends on the risks and effects caused by the crisis and how other nations evolve. We can already see this, for example, in the structure of global supply chains. If an ant falls, the entire colony trembles. And the fact is that for several months, many financial agents had been speculating that the Mexican peso was going to fall against the dollar, and despite everything during 2022, it never happened. But could this happen now in 2023? Well, of course, no economy in the world is exempt from falling. If the economy were easily predictable, believe me, there would be no reason for the stock market. In Mexico, for example, experts such as those from the Banorte financial group or Banamex maintain a positive view regarding the peso and its value in 2023, as long as certain factors are in place that help the currency to continue trading, such as the inflow of remittances and exports. They believe that the peso will remain strong. Meanwhile, other international rating agencies such as Moody's do not share this opinion. The truth is that although the so-called super peso closed 2022 as one of the best currencies in the world, we cannot let our guard down. There are very big risks ahead in 2023 that put our currency at risk, such as the aggressive monetary policy of the Fed itself, raising interest rates more and more, along with all the global problems that we already know about and that have been affecting all strong and emerging currencies that depend on its health and value. For example, there is an economic theory called the dollar smile, which could sink the Mexican peso perhaps. In short, it says that the dollar is the currency that monopolizes and sustains investors' business in times of recession, and that when the US economy is not booming and dollars are not actively purchased, the Fed's monetary expansion and recovery projections will always favor the United States over the rest of the world. Or to put it another way, the global economy is like a big casino where the house never loses, and the house is the US dollar, of course. That is why in times of crisis, speculators, investors, exporters, trust in the dollar's performance when the Fed tightens interest rates and decide to change their currency to the dollar. But this so-called dollar smile is not at all pleasant for most small and medium-sized economies. In fact, since more than half of global trade moves in dollars, the stability of emerging economies is at risk with the strengthening of the dollar, which could endanger not only the Mexican peso, but all the currencies of Latin America and the world, such as these, for example. Many foreign investors may distrust of financial institutions in less developed countries, or even if their markets are unstable and if the local currency does not move sooner rather than later. Governments will have to issue international debt in dollars, which will become increasingly unpayable as their interest rates rise. And that is when imports of food, medicine, and fuel fall and the economy begins to paralyze. As we have already mentioned, investors blindly trust the dollar. Even more so when emerging currencies lose value and it is no longer safe to keep their money in a broken piggy bank. But when they withdraw their investments to take them elsewhere, that causes the local currency to fall even more sharply and fiscal problems arise. It is like a kind of vicious circle. Manufacturers and companies that depend on imports always find it very difficult to pay to have their raw materials or products, and therefore inventories fall and productivity and employment decrease. It is an anvil that directly crushes the business apparatus of weak economies and always leaves many unemployed. But now that you know, I would like to know in the comments your response to the predictions of the world's leading credit rating agencies. Do you think the so-called Mexican super peso can continue gaining ground against the dollar in 2023, or that it will lose ground? I will be reading your response in the comments, and if this video has helped you learn something new or interesting, help me by subscribing to the channel. See you in the next one.